So good afternoon and welcome to our monthly EO webinar. My name is Marion Murphy and I'm delighted to welcome both of our speakers today. First up is Patricia Moore. She's founder and director, CEO of Promethio and co-founder and director of the Irish Space Association. Patricia will be presenting on space, tech and entrepreneurship opportunities in the Irish space economy. And then next we also have Antonia Blankenberg, lead consultant at Esri Ireland, and Antonia will be presenting on creating accessible web mapping applications. As with each of our sessions, our speakers will begin by introducing themselves and sharing an overview of their career journey so far. So let's get started with our first speaker. Patricia, maybe you can kick off there, please.
Super. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Marion, for inviting me to give me an opportunity maybe to share with some of the broader downstream community the opportunities that exist in the Irish space economy, which is really growing fast at the moment. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the status quo in the ecosystem in terms of Ireland and space tech, and hopefully that'll showcase to all of you working in the GIS space and integrating space assets with your work pipelines and can benefit your workflow and make for very interesting applications. And just before I dive into the presentation, I might just give you a little bit of background on myself and my career path. So I studied electronic engineering in Dublin City University, and I went on then to do a PhD in computational modelling and simulation at Dublin City University as well. And when I graduated, I became an assistant professor in the school. And I stayed there for a number of years, continuing my research and very heavily involved in teaching. Before I got the opportunity to get involved with the European Space Agency Makerspace that was run by the university, and it's an innovation campus actually in DCU Alpha. And the idea was to try and create a mini ESA, or European Space Agency kind of setup, whereby individual entrepreneurs or companies, startups, and could apply to solve specific challenges around the areas of IoT and M2M communication. And rather than deal directly with the European Space Agency, which can be quite bureaucratic for larger projects, that there would be a middleman that would help with the admin and help with the technology support, which would be provided by the university. And the overall project was outsourced to a company called Mindseed, which is a third-party contractor, and I was the academic liaison on the project, and that ran for 2 years in DCU Alpha, and I kind of got a little bit hooked, I think, on the entrepreneurial buzz and the space sector and the amount of opportunities that existed there. I actually left the university to work with Mindseed, which is a space technology consultancy company in Ireland based in Dublin. And I spent 5 years working with Mindseed then. And really the core business of Mindseed was to help to develop technology roadmaps for companies considering incorporating space assets into their workflows. And obviously that's a burgeoning opportunity in Ireland, which I'll talk a little bit about today. But I worked with numerous companies in the upstream and downstream segment right across the country to identify opportunities to incorporate space assets in their technology workflows, and also then to help them procure funding from the European Space Agency to allow them to deliver the technology into the market, and also to help project manage the actual technical program in order to make sure that they stay compliant with the European Space Agency's requirements and met all the milestones in a timely fashion. So I recently, just last year, set up my own company, Promethio. I'm looking at developing some EO IoT type applications. And I'll talk a little bit more about the opportunities that exist there, in the context of AI and new machine learning techniques that are coming down the tracks. There's huge opportunities around IoT for labeling EO data, and that's what I'm hoping to look at in my own company. I'm doing a little bit of consultancy at the moment as well for companies still, as part of my workflow. And I suppose what I want to talk to you about today is both the Irish Space Association and all of those nice opportunities that exist for hopefully everybody on the call. I'm just going to share my screen here, so I can share a few slides with you. So just bear with me for 2 seconds. And you might just let me know when you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see that, Patricia. Yeah, okay. That's fine.
Thanks, Marion. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was a little bit about the Irish Space Association and how it came to be, and what that means in terms of space tech and entrepreneurship and opportunities for you guys in the Irish space economy. So many of you might be aware that Ireland actually has a very steep history, or a very deep and rich history in space. And from 3200 BC, you might be familiar with the Newgrange Passage tomb that you can see in the background here, and that aligns with the winter solstice every year, and the chamber in the tomb lights up. And you could argue that that potentially is the world's oldest observatory. So we have a very rich history in being fascinated with space and the stars and the ecosystem. In 1843, Dublin-born William Rowan Hamilton discovered the mathematics for movement in space and quaternions, and he actually inscribed the formula on a bridge not too far from where I am today in DCU Alpha, and that has gone on to power nearly everything we do in space. In 1845, Leviathan was the world's largest telescope, and it remained so until 1917, and that was in Burgh Castle in County Offaly. And so a lot of people are surprised to hear that Ireland was actually heavy hitting, from way back then. And in 1975, we became a founding member of the European Space Agency. In 2019, we had the launch of our first national space strategy for enterprise. And in 2023, we had the launch of the Irish Space Association, and we also had Ireland launching its first satellite. So Ireland, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, it's just to give a flavour of the, contributions that Ireland has made over the years to the space sector globally, really. So where is Ireland today in terms of its contribution? So the ESA every year support a lot of the projects that are run in the Irish ecosystem, and is managed through Enterprise Ireland. And every year they produce a lovely report that kind of showcases, you might be familiar with the report, but it showcases all of the European Space Agency funded projects in Ireland, and gives you a profile of the companies involved, what kind of areas they're working in. It spans upstream and downstream. I really encourage you, if you're not familiar with these reports, to have a look at them, because it kind of gives you a sense of what's happening in the ecosystem and where the trends are. But you can see there, I just plotted the numbers of companies showcased in these reports over the years, back from 2010 right up until 2023. And I believe the new report is due out later this year during the summer, which will have an up-to-date figure. But you can see it's grown rapidly from about 30 companies back in 2010 to 109 companies now availing of European Space Agency funding. And I think the number is going to be significantly north of that again in the new report. So given the depth and wealth of activity that's happening in the ecosystem, a group of us decided, we gathered in Enterprise Ireland's headquarters to see, was there a need for some sort of industry representation, and further networking opportunities for the ecosystem, because space is quite challenging to work in, and it's a very niche area, especially on the upstream side, but even on the downstream side there are challenges, and the different funding ecosystems for that sector. How do we help everyone working in that ecosystem to understand the sector better and to share knowledge? And we decided that we would set up an Irish Space Association, and that was back in April in 2023. And our first meeting was really about the need for the association, and we immediately started organising networking meetings. So in July 2023 in DCU Alpha, where we're headquartered at the moment, we had a meeting to discuss the cluster effect. And so how could the companies that existed in the ecosystem cluster together, and share knowledge and network, and accelerate everybody's roadmap in doing so. And we had a very successful meeting where companies already doing well in the space sector, securing ESA funding, securing commercial contracts, gave talks about how they were doing it, and the benefits of them having organically communicated with other companies in the ecosystem to share that learning and knowledge. And so all we really did as the Irish Space Association was try and put a more formal wrapper around that. So our second meeting, then we thought we better bring in the research performing organisations. So reach out to academia, and a very important part of our ecosystem as well. So our second meeting was all about collaborating with research performing organisations. And again, we brought in a number of companies working in the space sector and academics working in the space sector who are successfully working together to share their knowledge about what makes it a successful partnership, what kind of funding models they were looking at, and they shared their knowledge as well. And so important for trainees coming out as well into the ecosystem. So just to give you kind of an idea of where people are in that ecosystem, this is an industry map. I know everyone likes maps, but this is the Irish industry landscape in 2010. And you can see in the top left of the screen, it's the upstream FDI segment. On the top right is the Irish controlled upstream. On the bottom left, it's the FDI downstream, and on the bottom right, the Irish controlled downstream. So you can see it was quite limited, quite a niche crew that were working in it. But you can see if we fast forward to 2023, and these slides are kindly provided by Enterprise Ireland, you can see an explosion in the ecosystem in every sector. And now we have an industry association wrapped around it. We have ESA Space Solutions Centre in Ireland, which supports a number of ESA BICs around the country, which provides opportunities for companies and startups as well. And so there's just really vibrant activity in the ecosystem at the moment. Now, a lot of the Enterprise Ireland statistics are based on who has availed of European Space Agency funding, which doesn't actually necessarily capture the full wealth of the ecosystem. There's lots of companies using space assets that may not identify as space companies, if they're using GNSS tracking, for example, and may not have availed of ESA funding for one reason or another. So we think that the number of companies in the ecosystem is actually larger than this. And based on our own kind of preliminary mapping, and these figures are very just who's reached out to us in the ecosystem since we started. We think that the space industry activities in Ireland are really loosely based, according to the geographic regions, that we might have about 107 companies in the east, 53 in the south, and about 13 in the northern and western regions. And the areas that those companies work in span data analytics, AI, quantum, photonics, advanced sensing, materials, telecoms, energy, enterprise software, Earth observation, propulsion systems, and even launch capabilities. And it's very hard to get up-to-date data on the value of the space sector to the Irish economy, but KPMG produced a report in 2023 where they said that the Irish space sector turned over €300 million and employed 1,140 people. I think the figures they quoted, they labelled them as being 2019 figures. And so I would expect that those numbers have risen significantly since then. But that just gives you an idea kind of the growth in the sector and the scale. So I suppose what's the opportunity for everybody on the call in terms of what's happening in the space ecosystem? Clearly the economy is growing in Ireland, but what's happening on the worldwide stage? So there's been an explosion in satellite launches in recent years. So you can see on the graph here, hopefully, that from the 1950s when satellites started to be launched, there was quite a low number of satellites being launched every year. But low-cost orbital access really changed that, and CubeSats, and reusable rocket launchers and off-the-shelf components. And once all these things came together, all of a sudden it was affordable to get into space. And you can see from that time, there was an absolute explosion of the number of satellites being launched. And it's hard to find a curve that isn't exponential over the last number of years. And Wall Street's, predicting that it's the next $1 trillion industry. And Bank of America is concurring that it'll double to 1.4 trillion to 1.8 million over the next decade or so. Morgan Stanley predicts that space-based businesses will create the world's first trillionaire. And much like every company, I suppose, has become a technology company in some way. Companies are now increasingly relying on space technology to deliver value. And there are other facets to space beyond the GIS and the EO, like there's space tourism, there's space medicine. And so lots of opportunities in the economy out there. And just to point out that Ireland launched its first satellite in 2023. So who knows, we might have our own more curve joining in with the rest of the world. And maybe just to point out that a lot of the satellites that we have in the ecosystem, like what type of satellites are they? The vast majority of them, especially in recent years, have been communication satellites. So a lot of them would be Starlink satellites for communications. But there are a good number of Earth observation satellites and GNSS satellites as well that would be useful maybe in the context of the GIS applications. So just in terms of where those opportunities lie for people who might be on the call today, I like to think about the commercial opportunities for space as being broadly divided into what can we use GNSS for, what can we use Earth observation or geospatial intelligence for, what can we use satellite communications for. And then on the opportunity side, I suppose it spans people developing end user applications, people distributing or managing the data or analyzing the data, and then you have the infrastructure piece, so opportunities to launch sensors into space or whatever that might look like, cloud platforms. And so, we're seeing lots of opportunities emerge under each of these, in the matrix. So most people on the call probably exist somewhere in this matrix. But if we start with EO, which is probably the most relevant maybe for the GIS, geospatial intelligence, like Earth observation provides remote sensing of the Earth's surface via satellite. And we're talking multispectral imagery for land use, for vegetation indices, and also for monitoring change over time. On the GNSS side of the house, and we're talking about accurate geolocation and time information. So things like GPS, Galileo, GLONASS, and Baidu. And there are great correction services now as well on the multi-constellations that can provide sub-meter accuracy in terms of global positioning. And it's also great for real-time monitoring of moving objects. And so they're all things that can help timestamp and geotag GIS applications. And then SATCOM, I suppose we think of SATCOM as communications links via satellite, but really that enables real-time data transmission. And so we're talking remote connectivity, real-time data sharing, and IoT and sensor backhaul is probably something that'll be very relevant to everybody on the call, which enables dashboards, etc., to be monitoring things in real time. And I suppose the big trends that we're seeing at the moment in this area is increasing fusion or integration of EO, GNSS, and SATCOM, and with the GIS, to enhance accuracy, efficiency, and reach of geospatial analyses. Proliferation of cloud-native platforms, and I suppose the real opportunities that are exciting everybody at the moment is the idea of having AI and machine learning applied to EO data within the context of GIS to understand the planet better and understand change of land use and things like that a lot better. One thing I'd just like to point out is that the USPA, which is the European Union Space Programme Agency, produce a lovely report every year, the market report. And it talks about EO and GNSS applications, and it divides it into various market segments. But again, it covers the wealth of opportunities that are out there under various headings like agriculture, climate, environment, forestry. It covers a very broad swathe of application areas. But it's a really good market report to look at as well, to get a sense of what people are working on at the moment in the European Union, where the challenges lie, and where the market opportunities are coming down the tracks. I suppose another thing to comment on is like the supporting that opportunity. So all these opportunities exist, but if any of you are involved in the startup world, it can be difficult to get off the ground and get some kind of funding in to help you develop your technologies and ideas. And the funding ecosystem and landscape is quite complex, I would say. It takes a while to get used to it. But there are various funding bodies that are specific for space. So we have the European Space Agency, we have USPA. And we have the Horizon Europe program as well that has space-related calls. And so this graph tries to give you an idea, I suppose, of the relative pots of money that are there versus the TRL level that your technology might be at, and the various ESA programs and Horizon programs, and also venture capital type programs and ESA BICs that are out there in the ecosystem. So it's a good graph to have a look at, just to get an idea of what kind of funding opportunities are out there, and you have access to the slides afterwards to go and investigate some of these funding programs. But I really encourage you to do that in terms of getting some support for developing applications. In terms of Ireland's contribution, supporting the opportunity, the European Space Agency contribution per capita by country is interesting to look at. And you can see here that all of the member states contribute various amounts, but Luxembourg is streets ahead of everybody in the amount of money it's investing in space per capita. And we see Ireland, it comes in about halfway down the list here, and it's investing about €6.13 in 2024 per capita. So that's, I suppose, a good reflection of where we sit in the overall European Space Agency in terms of how much we value space in our economy. And I suppose another reflection of how much we value space in our economy is that we had the first national space strategy for enterprise in 2019. It was actually launched here in Dublin City University at DCU Alpha. And it set out ambitious targets to double the space-related revenue and employment in space-active Irish companies, to support 100 companies to benefit from ESA engagement. And as we saw earlier, we already have 109, and the plan runs until 2025. So we've exceeded that. Develop and attract talent for space active and related industries, and develop a sustainable Earth observation services sector based on advanced data analytics and capability. So I think we're doing quite well against the goals that were set out in the National Space Strategy. And I suppose the conscious says 2025, so the work will have commenced to update this document, and there will be stakeholder consultations, and that's an area, maybe that's an opportunity for people to get involved in. There's also activity at the moment going on around a national space strategy for research. And a national advisory forum for space research has been formed, with stakeholders from across the ecosystem. Early conversations started in April 2024 in Dunsink. And there's been 2 follow-up meetings since in November 2024 and March 2025, where people just were trying to brainstorm the ecosystem for the research side of the community, because it is quite different from the ecosystem that exists for the enterprise ecosystem, and trying to bring that together. How do those 2 strategies, if there are 2, sit together? So there's a whole community of people trying to working on bringing that together at the moment. Another opportunity that's worth noting is that Ireland has recently joined CERN. And so an ISA delegation presented to CERN for their visit as part of the assessment process to join CERN. And in February 2025, our membership was accepted in principle. But that means that there will be new procurement opportunities available to people working in the space ecosystem. I know people think of CERN as theoretical particle physics and all that kind of thing, but they really the breadth of their procurement is immense. And I'm sure there will be opportunities there for the downstream segment as well. And we'll have to wait and see what kind of opportunities emerge. But they really touch on a much broader portfolio of science initiatives. And I suppose maybe just to finish up that, people don't associate Ireland necessarily with, being a player in the space race, but actually if you kind of follow Irish media in recent times, there's been a lot of activity, I would say, in space, lots of articles, lots of big funding wins for companies who are developing really, cutting edge technologies for delivery in space. And there was actually a documentary on Virgin Media there recently as well, called Celtic Cosmos, that showcased the Irish space ecosystem to a degree as well, and visited the Irish engineers and space enthusiasts who are working in ESTEC for the European Space Agency over in the Netherlands. So I really encourage you just to take the opportunity to look at some of those reports that I mentioned to get a flavour of what's happening in the ecosystem. And maybe keep track of the Irish media at the moment, because there seems to be a renewed interest in space, and we're seeing lots of articles and seeing what people are doing, what's new, and what's up and coming. And if I can help in any way through the Irish Space Association to help network for you guys in the Irish ecosystem, if anyone wants to be on the Irish Space Association mailing list, just let me know. My contact details are on the last slide. I look forward hopefully to working with you all in the not too distant future, and I'm very happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, for that. I mean, I think I definitely, personally speaking, there's been an explosion over the last few years, and I think the Irish Space Association in particular has been really, really valuable in terms of getting upstream, downstream together, creating that space for Enterprise Ireland, for companies, startups, research, everything to come together and discuss it, because obviously it is, as you mentioned previously there, sometimes it goes, or navigating the ESA funding streams and USPA and all of that can be daunting, to say the least. And once you're in and get the hang of it, it's not so bad, but it can be daunting, and looking for opportunities maybe to partnership or to just expand your offering is like somewhere like the Irish Space Association really gives an awful lot of information and help, and particularly accessing the right people in Enterprise Ireland, etc. So I know from I have attended the initial the starting or the launch and a number of events since, and I have to say it's a breath of fresh air to see that there's so much help there. Also, even just from we're way more sort of downstream, and generally the Earth observation remote sensing is where GIS fits into. And I have to say that it's also fascinating to look at the upstream and the technology that's available, or the technology they're working on, and the partnerships, and it's just fantastic, really, really good. And obviously Nora Patton has helped, and can't wait to see Nora how her journey to space goes. And I think that has helped. But yeah, massive explosion in terms of the exposure that it's getting, so it's great to see. I don't think it would be anywhere near as obvious only for it. Do you know what I mean? So but like some of those organizations like Ubotica and Embryonics and Realtra and all that's just amazing technology. So long may it last. But yeah, I
think it's really important, Marion. Like you touched on it there, that we're kind of a small country, but we benefit from the networking opportunity. Like most people within the sector kind of know each other, or know somebody who can connect them to somebody else in the sector, right across government, upstream, downstream, academia, industry, and enterprise. And it's just so important that people have access to each other to be able to work together. And the thing is, like, upstream and downstream don't exist in isolation from each other. Downstream needs to influence what kind of sensors need to be sent up there to collect the kind of data that you guys want for geospatial. And so without putting those stakeholders in the same room together periodically, those conversations don't get had. So that's
absolutely, yeah.
It's an ecosystem, and everyone is a part of it.
I know, and like obviously as well, we are an island off an island, so we, I mean, in main sort of when you're sort of speak at ESA events, maybe in Central Europe and stuff. Like it's just such, you can really see the size of the industry and the scale, because obviously a number of European countries are a long lineage in terms of the space sector, but we're there as well, and obviously as well, if there's opportunities to work on European projects, etc., it really does help with the network. So it's great to have the association there as well, as I say, the opportunity. So yeah, good stuff. Brilliant.
Maybe one other thing just to say as well, like if people are traveling to international events or they're interested in a specific international market, it is useful for the Irish Space Association to have access to that information, because we can help potentially coordinate broader activities so that you can kind of get more bang for your buck when you go to these events. And so it's useful for us to know if there's a demand or an appetite in the sector to go to a particular event, for example, to see could we put some additional resources behind it. And again, there's huge support internationally, I would say, for the the industry associations, and because people are looking for project partners from right across the European ecosystem. And we're a new organisation, so we're finding our feet and finding our way through that ecosystem at the moment. But the idea is to bring the value of that back to everyone in the community. And so the more we know about what the community wants, what they're thinking of attending, the more we can kind of pick and choose what we target in the immediate term to benefit everybody as the best we can in the immediate term.
Yeah, no, brilliant, because like we were at the Paris Space Week, not this year, last year, and like that, I mean, it opened up a whole new area to us, and like we're very, obviously that came through the Irish Space Association and Enterprise Ireland, so it was really, really good, I have to say. So I would highly recommend getting involved with the Irish Space Association, as I say, and letting yourselves know what areas of interest, because it's so much easier to do it in a community than it is on your own.
On your own with stuff.
Yeah. Brilliant. If anybody has any questions, just pop them into chat, and we can always go back over them maybe towards the end. But for now, thank you, Patricia. And Antonia, are you ready to kick off your presentation, please?
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Thanks very much, Marion, and fantastic presentation there, Patricia. Really interesting. So I'm going to talk today a bit about accessibility. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Antonia. I'm a lead consultant with Esri Ireland, and I work in our professional services department. And I specialize in utilities. So I work a lot with Archis Utility Network, particularly focusing on electric at the minute, but also working a bit with water and gas too, and fiber. I also specialize in user experience, particularly around accessibility and application design to make sure our users get the best application possible. And you might also see my name pop up as Maps by Antonia, where I do some cartography stuff, a little bit more creative, but fun nonetheless. So you might see my name pop up there as well. So I started off hearing about GIS when I did my undergrad in geography, and that was in Trinity College. And most of my work during that time was physical geography. And we actually got introduced to GIS in a module called Deserts of Our Solar System, led by Dr. Mary Burke. And what we did was we got DTMs of the surface of Mars, and we mapped them and looked for slope and different geomorphological features. And it was a bit of a roller coaster introduction, and I fell in love with it. So from there, I went and did a master's in GIS in TUD, then of course DIT. And once I did that, I joined Esri Ireland as a GIS consultant in 2019, where I did a lot of fun stuff, but also really enjoyed creating applications and making them look really nice and get a really nice user experience. So that's where my love of UX came in. In 2022, I became a senior consultant. And again, I worked a bit more with UX. So I worked on a handful of projects, including the Marine Spatial Planning Hub called marineplan.ie, and a project for Queen's University in Belfast called Place Names NI, which is all about finding the history of various place names in Northern Ireland. And then from there, a couple of years ago, I became a lead consultant, which is where I am now. And again, further focused on UX. So that's where I got some qualifications in UX and really start focusing on accessibility. And so now my job is basically to give technical oversight to our projects and also to give a hand in creating really accessible applications. And now, as I mentioned, my focus is in utilities as well. So we're learning more and more about dealing with utilities as we go in the utility network. So it's a constant learning experience at the minute. So that's where I've ended up from that picture on the left, standing on a cliff in Clare, to dealing with our customers and making really accessible experiences for everyone. So diving in straight in, what is accessibility? So accessibility is basically how we make experiences open and usable for people with diverse abilities. And what that means is everyone has a different level of ability in a few key areas, such as like cognitive, visual, hearing, motor, speech, and many, many other things. And that difference of ability, when we don't have an accessible experience, basically we create a disability. So it's a blocker for someone to access what they need to access. And what's important to understand here is that this may not just be someone who is, let's say, blind. It could also be you go and get laser eye surgery and for a few weeks you have a patch over your eye, or it could be, you know, you wake up in the morning and your eyes are really fuzzy and you're tired, so it could be something very temporary as well. So it's really important not to think about accessibility as the other person over there who's, it won't impact me. It may impact everyone at certain times. So as I mentioned, that diversity of abilities can be something that's cognitive. So it could be something like neurodiversity, learning disabilities, mental health disorders, memory disorders, someone who may have seizures, and many other things in that area. It could be auditory, so someone who's hard of hearing or deaf. It could be visual, so someone who may be blind, have a vision impairment, someone who's colorblind. It could be speech, or it could be something physical, like, for example, someone doesn't have a left arm. It could be someone who walks on crutches, someone who uses a wheelchair, and again, many other things in that area. So what we want to do is really create applications and maps that appeal to everyone and everyone can use as much as possible. How do we do that? Other people have already thought about this, and we have created, sorry, not we, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, or you may see people say WCAG, but I call it WCAG. And it's basically a set of guidelines for all web content to make it accessible as much as possible. So you may hear people saying their website is WCAG compliant, and that basically means they've met a certain list of guidelines in many areas of accessibility to create an accessible website. I'm not going to dive into every detail of WCAG because we could be here for a month, so we'll try and keep it light. So at a very high level, there's 4 different principles in WCAG. These are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, also known as POUR. So perceivable basically means content is visible or auditory, so someone can interact with the content on the site. Operable means users can interact with the page. So if there's a button on the page that says, you know, bring me home, that it actually is in fact clickable and can bring you home. Understandable means users have to be able to understand the interface. So that could mean, for us, if we use really technical GIS jargon for something that's designed for maybe an elderly person to use, that's not very understandable. So we want to make sure the text uses the type of paraphrasing that people would be familiar with and really make it understandable, but also that it behaves in a predictable way. So if you have a little home button, you'd expect it to bring you home rather than, let's say, to a credits page on your website or something. So to make it make sense and use best practices and what you commonly see on websites. And then robust basically means different technologies can interact with this site or this application. So that means maybe screen readers, mobile responsiveness, or any other technologies that may interact with web content. So in terms of mapping, I'm going to focus purely on the first one of those columns, which is perceivable, because it's the easiest to talk about. But I do urge everyone to dive in at a further level to go and look at the other principles. I like to term perceivable as visual accessibility, what you see, and that goes on like 5 or 6 different pillars. So you have your layout and your visual hierarchy of the page to make sure you can actually see the content. You may focus on color, typography. There may be alt text for screen readers to interact with images, and then magnification. I'll start with color. And again, this is a very high level. But there's 3 areas of color that I like to think of when we're creating applications. The first being that color blindness is considered. So about 4% of the total world population has some sort of color vision deficiency. It's a little bit more common in men than it is in women, and there's various different types of color deficiency. So you may be familiar with these colorblind tests where you may or may not see a number correctly. So it's important to consider that a lot of people can't see the difference between red and green. So if your map goes from red to green in color, users may not understand what that map is trying to tell you. There's loads of filters and colorblind checkers online if you want to check out the way your map looks. If you want to put in a screenshot of it, it'll show you what it looks like if you had color blindness. The next one after that is contrast, and this is a really key one with colors. So when there's little contrast, like the image on the left here, it's very difficult to see what text may say, or may be difficult to see the difference between 2 different symbols on a map. So it's important to keep a certain level of contrast, and that level of contrast is called the contrast ratio. So it's basically a number, 2 numbers that compare color 1 to color 2, and if you have a high ratio, you'll see a bigger number. If you have a low ratio, you see it's a 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 or so on. And again, there's checkers for this online. So it's recommended by WCAG that we have at least 3 to 1 for large text and 4.5 to 1 for normal body text. So it's important to consider what colors are being used. If you're writing paragraph text, you want to keep a really high contrast. And then last of all, just to think about color psychology a little bit and think about common uses of colors. So for example, a lot of people see red as bad and green as good. So if you're putting an error message, for example, or showing something bad on the map, you may go with red. And if you're showing something good, you may go with green, obviously considering color blindness at the same time. So you may also use different symbols to go with that to allow users to really understand. And also in here, you may also think about the brightness of your colors. So if your entire page is neon pink and the text is black, even though it is technically accessible, it has a high contrast and it won't impact people with color blindness, it may give you a bit of a headache. So it's important to just consider what it would be like to stare at that color for the day if you're working on that particular application. The next big pillar to think about would be typography. So not just the color of the text, but what the text looks like. So it's important to consider font size. So if you're staring at a page that has really small font size, it can be a bit of a headache, especially if you have a vision deficiency. So it's important not just to pick a larger size of font, but also to make sure that the user can zoom in on the page easy and still make sense of that font. So that's what we call magnification, to allow users to really zoom in up to 200% without any loss of content. And the other thing to consider then is the actual font. So if I picked a really cursive font and made a massive page in my web mapping application that was all in that cursive font and it has paragraphs of text, it may be difficult to read, as you can imagine. So it's really good to pick what we call sans serif fonts. So those are the fonts that don't have the little like feet on them, and they're called serifs. So if you pick a sans serif font and you make it nice and large and have sufficient spacing in between the lines, it makes it much easier for users to read and make sense of that text. But how does that apply to maps? Because obviously a map doesn't have a huge amount of text going on. So the first thing we can consider is symbology. So you see this little screenshot here on the left, it doesn't just use color, but it also uses shape. So even if a user is colorblind, they'll still be able to see, okay, the circle is 1 to 49 and the triangle there on the right hand side is over 5,000 customers affected by this type of outage. So it means even if the user only sees in grayscale, they'll still make sense of what's going on. And it's also easier if you had a screen reader reading this out to say, a green circle rather than just a green point versus a red point. It makes a little bit more sense. The other thing to consider with symbology is maybe certain symbols have different meanings. So this little pink upside down triangle, which is the outages on this map, may also have a different meaning. So this is a symbol that holds strongly with the LGBTQIA plus community. So it is a symbol that means something to them that is positive. So if you put it on the map as something that is negative, like a power outage, it may bring about negative connotations for that community. So it's important to think about what symbols are actually being used. The other thing you can consider with your map is the pop-ups if you're smart mapping. So does your pop-up contain text that makes sense to the user? Is it of a font size that's large enough to see? If there are images, do they have alt text to read? Obviously, we don't want to see loads of underscores and object IDs and things like that in pop-ups because they don't mean a lot to users. So really thinking about what the user needs to get out of that pop-up and that symbol can really help with accessibility. With regards to labeling, the same things that I said about font applies. So make sure you're using a font that has high contrast against your base map. Make sure the font is large enough to read. Consider the content. Does it make sense for the user, or is it something really technical that they may not understand? And a really nice way to achieve contrast, knowing that obviously base maps may change color depending on where you are. The user may select a different base map from a base map gallery. So a nice thing to achieve contrast all the time is a halo. And you'll see there from that screenshot, it just makes sure that there's contrast against every color. And it really just enforces that because you're comparing black and white instead of various shades of green. If you're using satellite imagery in Ireland, you'd get a million shades of green. So just guarantees that you get that nice bit of contrast. So it's a nice win. And the last thing to consider is base map. I like to put base maps in two categories, one being what I call a reference base map and the other being a detail-oriented base map. So a reference base map may just give you an idea that, you can see the Phoenix Park in the background, you're somewhere near the Phoenix Park, whereas a detailed base map may show the different lamp poles and manholes that are on the street in the Phoenix Park. So depending on what you're trying to convey to the user, it's important to consider what base map should I set as default. And in addition to that, is it a light base map? Is it a dark base map? And that may help your decision of symbology. So if all your points are white and your base map is white, it's not going to be very clear to the user. And just to note as well, within the Esri base map gallery, there are high contrast base maps. So if you need a detail-oriented base map, you may want to choose a high contrast one that really lets the users fully understand what is in that area that your data is in. And then moving from maps to applications. So of course, usually our smart maps are within an application. You may want to consider a few other things like keyboard control. So a lot of screen readers and other assistive technology uses keyboard control under the covers to navigate around the page. So it's worth just seeing if you can navigate around a page that you've designed with a keyboard. I recommend looking up standard keyboard navigation. If you give it a Google, it'll come right up. And then further to that, within the Esri suite of applications, there's further documentation on how to navigate the map. So I'm sure that is also there for open source technologies as well. So just consider, how would a user get around this map if they only had a keyboard and they couldn't use a mouse? And then the other things we have control over are layout and mobile responsiveness. So of course, most users now use mobile first when they navigate the web. And so it's important to consider different things for mobile responsiveness, like making sure buttons are clear in the center. Menus tend to be a little bit simpler than on desktop. And then a lot of users have familiar gestures that they use, like swiping to navigate between applications and things. So it's important to consider that as well. Another thing to avoid is scrolling horizontally instead of vertically. So of course, if you're on a phone, a lot of people will swipe up. So just to consider that when you lay out your applications. And just in terms of layout in general, it's really nice to see consistency between different pages and getting nice spacing and and padding around different elements to make it usable, and really enforcing hierarchy so the user can make sense of where they are on the page and what kind of thing that map relates to, and the same with, of course, pop-ups as well. And then last of all, down here, I've written alt text. So it's really important that all the images have alt text so that a screen reader can interact and get a clear description of what that image is, especially if it's important to the context of the page. That might be a story map or a dashboard. So for example, here, this picture of Martin Luther King would be very key to what the story map is trying to tell us. So it's important to get that clear description. So overall, this is just a very, very high level of what accessibility can be within web mapping. There are loads of really nice resources out there to dive further in. But of course, if there's any questions, you can contact me. I'm on social media as Maps by Antonia, but I'm also on LinkedIn, and my email is here. So if anyone has questions, reach out. I'm a big advocate for getting accessibility into web mapping.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I couldn't agree more. I think it's as much, it's extremely important, considering the user, the end user, whether that is a colleague or a customer or somebody really not familiar with even the content. It could be local authority, the web map, and that the public are using, and just how the design in terms of how it's designed and how accessible it is and how easy it is to maneuver through is extremely important. So I think that's a very, very important topic to address. And I would suggest that if there is further resources, or I'm assuming that there's resources online, as you mentioned, or even with the WCAG, for any user, any GIS professional should really be heavily considering all of that in terms of the design of their WebGIS, or just in general. I think as well as that, even in terms of software development is really important, but even, as I say, in the geospatial sector, clearly it's a priority. So thank you very much for that. Anybody, any questions for Antonia or for Patricia? Please drop them into the chat, or if you can unmute yourself, you can feel free to do so. I just have a quick see. Just from Sita there, thanks for the presentation, Antonia. A very nice presentation. In today's remote world, I still find that people forget to enlarge symbology or legends, and it's often very difficult to read presented material. Any advice on that?
Yeah, I can't offer any advice in terms of reading, something that someone has provided, but the main thing is to start a conversation. I would say start a conversation about accessibility and getting a good experience out of maps, because I know a lot of people will make a static map and send a PDF and then they forget about it. So my big push would be start a conversation, start talking about it, urge people to make their maps accessible, and hopefully we start receiving better maps.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it is important, as I say. Yeah, there's nothing worse than having to multiply by 100 just to get to view what the symbology is, etc. So yeah, that's very good. Have you any advice? Is there any particular resource that you would initially have looked at, or anything in resources that Esri have that some of the users may want to access?
Yeah, Esri have a library on accessibility. If you just search Esri accessibility, it will pop straight up. The University of Minnesota also has a fantastic set of resources on, particularly about mapping and making maps accessible. So I highly recommend that as well. And again, if you just search University of Minnesota GIS accessibility, it should come straight up. It's a really, really good resource.
I think it's a module that everybody should have at university, if nothing else, because it's so important that people can, make sense of the information that's presented to them. So yeah, no, it's fantastic. I'm delighted that you highlighted that today, Antonia, because hopefully we'll be seeing fantastically accessible maps in the future, or more accessible. Yeah, so anyone else have any questions? I know we're coming towards the end of our hour, so, and I know, Antonia, you have other meetings to get to as well. So let's see, we have Sheila. Great tips for creating web maps, dashboards. Really useful to test before circulating a link to colleagues. The creator gets so familiar with what they're creating that they might miss something that isn't clear. I agree, Sheila, 100%. Everyone's focused on the data and getting it out to whoever needs it rather than how it looks. So brilliant. Okay. Well, for ourselves, we will obviously have June's webinar coming up on the first Wednesday of the month, and then we will be taking a break. So for the summer, and we will be back in September. So for today, if that's all of our questions, maybe we can wrap up. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you found the sessions as insightful and inspiring as I have. And special thanks to our speakers for generously sharing their time and their experiences with us. As I mentioned at the beginning, the recording will be available soon on our YouTube channel, so feel free to revisit or to share it with anybody that may have missed it. And yes, we look forward to seeing you at our session in June as well. So thank you to Patricia and Antonia and everyone else who tuned in today. I think we can safely say that was definitely inspiring. So thanks a million to everybody, and we will see you at the next one. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.